You have slides that go around?
I do not.
No bog turtle?
I know, people have to imagine them. I should have made bog
Who
turtle.
deserves the bog
I have a
turtle?
picture of the bog turtle.
Well, I speak for the bog turtle.
I like, yeah, bats.
All right, back to normalcy now. Hi there, friends and colleagues. Just another day of conversations with the curator. We are a monthly behind the scenes look into our collections and our exhibits here at NCHGS. My name is Sarah White. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Society, and I am joined by my colleague Tim Betts, Curator of Exhibitions.
Hi, everyone.
Absolutely beautiful day too. I don't know why I did this. This is so ominous. This beautiful day, cracks knuckles. Beautiful day to talk about the ecological impact of warehousing.
It is actually.
Didn't plan that. So today we're going to dive into the relationships between warehousing and the ecosystems that they occupy and also create environmentally, socially, and also economically. So when we think of ecosystems, right, we usually think of like the actual ecology of a place, right? Animal, plant life, and their relationship with the physical land that they are on. But how else can we define an ecosystem? Such as, let's say, for example, an economic ecosystem or a social ecosystem in terms of warehousing.
I mean, I think you're really thinking like ecosystem here, we can use like as a substitute word, I know, right? As a substitute word for like a system, right? Or a network, right? And I think like historian, like, so it's like we're kind of having two conversations here, I think, as we often always do, right? So it's like
only two,
maybe more than that, right? But it's like, so if we're thinking of environment and ecology and that kind of ecosystem, right? That we can think of that kind of in a historical way, right? And kind of what it means to study those, right? And like historian Tim and the field of history in general is very keen at the moment on the study of networks and ecosystems, right? So I think that's kind of part of that. So we can have that kind of like historical conversation, but it's like ultimately all of that, like outside of the like historical thing I said there about like networks and relational interaction, right? Like, everything like in studying warehouses or in thinking about warehouses or in kind of what we thought about warehouses for Warehouse Valley, the warehouses don't exist in a vacuum, right? So they're not just like, here are the warehouses now, behold a warehouse. It is the warehouse and it is the environment that causes the warehouse. It is the economic systems that make warehouses financially viable. It is the systems of local zoning and law, right? The local government, developers purchasing land, right? And buying land and building on the land, which they're of course legally entitled to do, right? And that local zoning allows for. It is the broad like economic in ecosystem and environment in which we all live, right? Because it's like a warehouse, you know, like when you buy something online, it comes from a warehouse, right? If you buy something from a store, it comes from a warehouse, right? So it's ultimately like the ecosystem of capitalism, dare I say, right? Like I think that's kind of part of
that's
that
a
too.
good phrase.
Ecosystem of capitalism, yeah, trademark that, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's like, of course, I think our discussion here is we're gonna talk about environment and kind of what that means, but I think that is part of a larger story, right? That really that ecosystem, that environment, that system, we can think of it in a wide variety of ways. I think that includes us, right? Because I think it's like, we're here going to, you know, we'll talk about briefly, and I know I should have had pictures of like the bog turtles and the blue spotted salamanders, but people can look up the bog turtles and enjoy your favorite picture of a bog turtle, right? But it's like, if we're thinking about the animals that are displaced by development, because they are, right? we also in that must include another animal, which is Homo sapiens, right? Like us,
Right.
the human animal, right? So it's like we are influenced by that and we shape that environment in which we live.
Mhm.
Right. So I think it's that broad environment or a discussion of the environment includes us as the primary driver of that
Right.
environment in a way.
Right, for better or for worse.
For better or
as
for
we have
worse.
seen both.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So it's like, I'm not gonna tangent too long.
Uh-oh.
No, it's not off, it's related, but.
Yeah.
So the Lehigh Valley, where we are, has a long history as an industrial center, as a transportation center, and as just like a hub
Right.
in general, of
Exactly.
communication, of people, of settlement. So the broader definitions of an ecosystem that we're discussing, they're not new.
No.
The language that we use might be different than
Right.
what we used 300 years ago, but the idea is not new.
Right.
But why is it so important to A, contextualize them, and B, to understand these concepts now in the 21st century as we become certainly more globalized than we were when Easton was founded 250 years ago?
Absolutely. So I think, well, you said a lot there that now spiraled me into tangents. So
That's how it happens, guys.
it's what we do. Yeah. So like it's vitally important that we consider all of this as part of, let's say, a broader ecosystem,
Mhm.
right? We have to consider historically Easton's role in kind of the broader region,
Mhm.
the region's role in the development of industrialization in the nation, right? Kind of its proximity and location along the Delaware River, right? But like I would argue, so it's like if we're thinking of like this kind of like when Easton is founded, it's part of a global system,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Which is kind of like my I feel like I'm always end up kind of like, but actually this, but it's like a but actually, yeah, because it's like
Yeah.
people can think about like Easton in the 18th century or Easton historically as like, oh, it's this town along the Delaware, like, strategically close to like Philadelphia, right? But like, you know, perhaps they might say the boonies, right? But like Philadelphia was, before the American Revolution, the second largest port city in the British Empire,
Yeah.
second to London, right? Easton's not far from that and is alongside what would have historically been like the highway, the Delaware River.
Right, yeah.
So it's like it had always been part of a global system. But like that was my like tangent. Because I think it's because I think of like things moving around imperially all the time,
Right,
as far as stuff I do, right? But like, so like that kind of globalization had always been there, but it's like vitally important to think of like the things that occur here in the valley and kind of these creation of warehouses and these kind of intervention to the land, should we say, they exist globally and they have global repercussions, right? Like a thing we showcase in Warehouse Valley is like the arrival of cargo into the Allentown airport, right? So it's like that is part, like planes landing with stuff on them to go to like warehouses or other things, like that is part of a like large global network of shipping moving around, right? So it's like if you're thinking about any of this or like anything historically or like anything that we have as a consumer, you have to consider that as part of a large global network. Like it's very hard to not, right? Like I'm just kind of like looking at the stuff like in front of me, right? Like it's like my computer, my iPhone, and my Apple Watch, they didn't come from here, right? Like I don't know where my thermos came from, but
Probably not
from here, right? So it's like to understand them as material objects, you have to understand them as something that I interact with, but also as something that came from a broader world. Right. So it's like that understanding is like kind of vitally historically important for us that ask these kind of questions of history, and also vitally important just kind of as someone that exists in that ecosystem to consider, right? And the other thing too, which is another part of that question, right? Like, I think really, for me, like as we thought about Warehouse Valley and as it came together, like the undercurrent of it isn't necessarily the warehouses are here now, right?
Right.
Even though the warehouses is part of the title, right? It rather is this idea that like development and the changing landscape and industrialization happen in phases, and this happens to be the present phase, right? So it's like, I kind of think it's to understand like what's happening with warehousing and kind of the selling of farmland and the saving and use of green spaces and kind of all that. Like, it's like vitally important to think of, you can't just think of that as happening now. That is built upon the historic landscape, right? Like, why are the farmers' fields being sold to be warehousing and development? Because the way that works changes, right? There's shifting from agrarian to other uses, right? So like, I think it's, yeah, it all ultimately is interconnected, right? That's got long as usual rattly answer.
Right. No, well, no, I like what you said, that like, this is not the first time that this has happened.
Absolutely not.
Especially not in this area.
No.
You've been here for more than 5 minutes. You can see the changes block to block.
Absolutely.
But not to tangent too much, but something I was listening to the other night that was talking more like from the indigenous point of view, but the term like prehistory or pre-contact, like whose contact?
Right.
Whose history?
That's a
whole different thing.
a whole
But,
other
like,
thing, right?
Thinking about like pre-contact in terms of like early industrialization, it was like, no, there was still industrialization happening. It just looked very different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like the traditional definition of history is it's recording of things based upon the written language, right? Which that favors certain knowledges, right? That's a whole thing, right? I'm just gonna say that and then put that over here because that'll be our hour if I open that door, right? But yeah, I mean, so I think like a thing for me that keeps kind of like, I think is a vital understanding of this discussion, both for like what we're talking about, which is like maybe environmental impact in different ways than like someone might expect, but also the environmental impact of like the Lorax question, right? Like, is this idea of kind of what Warehouse Valley is, what that kind of successive history of industrialization in the valley is, which is this concept, right? Which is both useful and at times unuseful of a epoch of Earth's existence that we could call the Anthropocene, right? So like when I talk about epochs of existence, right? Like that's like the Cretaceous period and like the Mesozoic, right? So it's like these like broad things of time, and like it's time on like a scale of millions of years, right? Like it is time that is so deep, like people call it deep time, right? So large, that's like, how can we as humans that have a lifespan of like 100 years, if we're lucky, conceptualize what 65 million years is, right? Like that's very hard to conceptualize, right? So like these big epochs of time caused and shift by like asteroids or like large changing things, right? But like when people talk about the Anthropocene, this is something that really happened post-industrial revolution,
right?
And really kind of really taking off in the 20th century. In some ways, it could be tied to the invention, use, and continued buildup of nuclear weapons, right? But like the Anthropocene is a time that people theorize, and there's all kinds of like debate as to how useful it is, right? But it's like a period of Earth's existence in which the planet is shaped by human. That's the anthro of Anthropocene, right? So it's like when we're talking about like Warehouse Valley and we're talking about like the Lehigh River and we're talking about the spotted salamander and we're talking about like us doing all that thing, that's the Anthropocene. But also the Anthropocene is us putting train tracks in. Also the Anthropocene is us digging up slate, shipping it around, us building canals, us building bridges, right? Like it is a time in which like other species on the planet impact the environment, right? And do things and have their ecological niches and do these things. But like in these particular cases, humans are directly altering the landscape,
Right.
right? And directly changing the landscape, because ultimately Anthropocene is broadly then a discussion of the changing of the landscape, but also, and human caused climate change, right? So that's like kind of an undergirding current thereof, right? But like, it's this change of the landscape, right? Because it's like drive around the valley, right?
Oh,
Like,
God, yeah.
it didn't look like this before human arrival, right? And
Right.
even, you could even talk about how the Anthropocene, in a way, like the environment's changed even by like indigenous experience on the land, right? There's, the kind of changing of, paths and kind of
Right,
creating
right.
things, right? But like, these kind of like permanent incursions of like,
Right.
I drive in like on 78, right? And it's like blasting out like parts of the rock face to like
Yeah.
let the highway go through. That's the Anthropocene, right?
Let's
Like,
talk about the garbage dump.
yeah, right. So it's like, that's kind of a undercurrent of it.
Yeah.
I think, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
that brings that kind of all together, I think, right? Because it's like the Anthropocene is this changing of the landscape, but it's also this like centering, for good or for ill,
Right, right.
of human as this like caretaker of land,
Yes.
right? And changer of land.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think much in like the ecology, however you define it, is a relationship.
Absolutely.
So it's the kind of relationship between recognizing that you are a person who, we say this every time, we live in a society, but being cognizant of your impact, where you are, how you are interacting with the things and the people and the other life around you is different than, let's say, one guy fishing in the Delaware and the impacts of building a dam to
Absolutely.
fish, right?
Yeah.
So one of the big burning comments that we hear in a lot of the feedback for Warehouse Valley is that warehouses are encroaching on green spaces. And I'm not saying it's a misinformed comment, but I think that from a historian's perspective who is trained to see things in context, as humans that live in 2025, we often think that green spaces are spaces for us.
Right.
But warehousing also has an immediate impact on things that go far, far beyond us, that
Right.
then impact us.
Right.
So if we remove our immediate want, this is for me of the 21st century, what is the implication then for the several species that are either now completely gone or are at risk because of the development? Like, there's multiple questions that I want to ask here, but like, as I'm formulating them as I speak, because it doesn't matter what I write down, I'm gonna go off of that anyway.
Right.
But I guess let's start with like, what is a good way from the perspective of our field and what we study, what is a good way for us to, I guess, decentralize ourselves and start to see ourselves as more of like a metaphorical organic community? This is kind of more of a question I was gonna ask at the end, but
that's a big question, right? Because I think like the work of because it's like, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a ecology, like I don't study the environment, right? Like I study people, and sometimes those people are in the environment is part of it, right? In so many ways, but it's like, historically, when you look at these, how do you decentralize people? That I don't really have a really great answer to, right? Because it's like, the decentralizing of people isn't necessarily it's not really a historical question, right? Because it's like, history is about people, and it's like kind of like a lot of our work, things you and I talk about a lot, right? Like, it's like, how do you like expand like traditional view of history, right? Of like people writing stuff down and like, here's the founding father, right? And how do you like complicate that and expand that narrative, right? But there's like, it's a harder historical question to say like, oh, what does wither than the bog turtle, right? Like, or wither than that, right? So it's like, there is a like subset of historians that are particularly interested in environmental history and the role we have in the environment, which is a very important research tool, right? But I think it's like partly it's like in order to do that, we have to kind of also decentralize the role of us as human, right? Like, so I think that's like a harder, almost like philosophical question, right? Because I think like, as of course, yes, of course, it's a philosophical question because it's you're asking me, right? So it's like, because Western society isn't equipped for that, really, right? And kind of like even if we're thinking about it historically, right? It is this like it's consumptive, it is extractive, it is relational, it is transactional, but it's not it's a relationship in which it's human and then the non-human, right? And that relationship changes and we ask new questions of that relationship, but like for the most part, Western society is kind of centered on that, right? Like human and everything else, whatever that might mean. So like in some ways that like asking about green space, that is, it can be very well intentioned, but it is also, it's a very human question, right? It's an important question, right? Because I think we want green space, because if we don't have green space, what we're just like living in, like, it's just concrete. Pave paradise to put up a parking lot or something, you know, right? But like, you know, like if you're not preserving green space, like what's the point?
Right.
But also like, are you saying you're preserving green space for the turtles, right? So it's like, so I think it's like, it's a hard question, right? It's a hard question to kind of like figure out live, right? But it's like, I think it's a matter of like asking more questions about what it means to be human in the environment than historical questions, right? If that makes sense, right? So I think it's like I think it's a whole different question, right?
A
whole different.
No, and like, I think that's because I was trying to ask you one question and then it got away from me. But I think this is good too, because like the purpose of this series is that you guys in the audience can see the kind of things that we talk about on a daily basis.
We do talk about this.
How we formulate all of our thoughts. This is what it looks like, honestly. Just two of us sitting at a table going.
Admittedly, we're like very far away. That's I picked a really weird table. But yeah, no, so I think that's an important question, right? But it's like
not something that you or I, as historians in our respective field, necessarily have an answer to.
No, but I think it's something that you and I as humans should question, right? But it's like that's a hard historical question, right? But because there's definitely like, there's all sorts of scholars that work on environmental history. There's people that work on the history of like our relationship with animals, like the importance of rats and what rats mean, right? Which is rats shape world history, right? Like, or like people that study disease, right? Like the disease is their central thing they look at in their central mode of analysis, because like you want something that like changes how the world works, like tuberculosis or
you just read that book.
Or like bubonic plague or flu, like influenza, right? So it's like COVID, right? So it's like they are there's all sorts of non-human, and all of those are non-human actors, right? Like of bacteria is a non-human actor, but like that shape and influence the and are like kind of important and vital ways to understand the history, right? But it's like that kind of whole relational thing that's different, I think, in a way. That makes sense.
Cool. Sorry to just
drop
that bomb.
Making my brain work.
12:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. Sorry, I'm asking you to like philosophize about the world.
Right.
Anyway, back to the question I was initially going to ask you, related to. Nope, lost myself. This happens way too often to historians, by the way. And another thing, and then the other thing just never happens. So let's talk about the turtles. So let's talk about these cute little guys. So, oh no, there, nope, it came back. It came back. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for your help.
We'll get to the turtles.
We'll get to the turtles, and the bats. What are some of the factors that, as we are, like, as the landscape, no, I don't want to say as the landscape shifts, as we shift the landscape, because we are actors in this. What are some of the ways that we shift the landscape to contribute to the habitat loss? Before we even talk about the turtle.
I mean, everything we do,
Literally
right?
everything we do.
Literally
yes.
everything we do. The building of not just warehousing,
Mhm.
right? The building of everything,
Mhm.
right? The building of roads, the building of power lines, those fans, you know, the large windmills for
Oh, yeah.
generating electricity, right?
Mhm.
Literally everything, driving to work, throwing something out,
Mhm.
right? So it's literally literally everything,
Right.
right? And that's not necessarily new either,
Mhm.
but it's like literally all aspects of modern existence are
Right.
contributing to that,
Mhm.
right? Like there's a reason that like this time of year, but for some reason it never happens at my house, which is baffling to me. But this time of year, you always hear people complaining about like, now it'll happen as I say this,
Right.
like deer coming into their yard and like eating their plants, right? Like
Hmm.
eating their hosta or like eating their beginnings of their vegetable garden and all sorts of stuff. It's like, okay, and then I could do various things to prevent that, but like, why are the deer coming into your yard, right? Like, because
We're in the deer's yard.
you're in the deer's yard, right? Like, why are the deer in the road? Because the road is where the deer are. You know, it's like,
Right.
you know, like as you're building, like settlements, it's like you're driving around. I say settlements like it's like, you know, the 16th century. But like as you're building like towns and you're putting in like, you know, like large apartment complexes and you're building like, you know, here's this new townhome development and here's this new grocery store and
Right.
here is the play park and here's the dog park and here's all these things, right? It's like as you're doing that, you are like infringing on the landscape in a
Right.
way. And it's like not saying don't build anything because of course build stuff because we want to go to stuff and do
Right.
stuff and
We are
enjoy
people.
the thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's like that should have a you know, that has an impact, right? And I think it's like a thing that I know we've said here, but we've definitely talked about is like landscape is memory, right? That's
Mhm.
kind of the
Mhm.
where like the opening intro text of Warehouse Valley is landscapes have memory, right? And that like the deer where they shouldn't be, or like
Mhm.
the you know, the geese in your yard, or like these various like non-human actors doing things. And by that I mean like animals, right?
Right.
Just using a like weird word for it, but like the animals and that there are insects doing things and like
Mhm.
you're you know there are flies and then there are bees doing things and you're upset about the carpenter bees and kind of all these things, right? It's like that is all because of how we have interacted with the land in a way,
Right.
right? So like because yeah, you're right, we're in their land. Like you see a fox in your backyard and it's like, okay, yeah, like the fox has been here forever,
Yeah.
right? Like not that fox, but like the idea of foxes in
Right.
eastern Pennsylvania, right? So it's like that landscape memory is true of the Warehouse Valley. Like, okay, you know, like this is where a farm was, now it is not, right?
Mhm.
So that's that landscape memory. But it's also like that kind of long, deep landscape memory,
Mhm.
right? Of like the making of the river and
Mhm.
kind of the, you know, like the mountains and like the
Mhm.
animals that are in that, right? So it's like that kind of ecosystem that has long existed and shaped and evolved and changed, right? But it like had always been there, right? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, like, I was thinking, this was a couple years back, but was it in LA that like there was a bear at like City Hall, or not, probably not City Hall, but some other like government building. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, I'm so scared that there's a bear in this government building. It was like, you put a bear on the state flag.
Right.
You can't act surprised when it shows up.
Yeah, like don't act surprised when like the bear comes, like a bear comes and tries to get in your garbage. Like bears exist, right? Like
That's the thing they do.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I had this flash of genius a couple of years back when I put tiny trees in my front yard, and then I was like, I can't go outside because there's just bees at my front door. And I was like, that was the point.
Right.
That was the point.
Right. But the thing too, like I think like a plot of this, right, which is kind of that like that human environment on the landscape,
Mhm.
right? And kind of our relationship to the environment. And by that I mean like the animals in the environment, the land, the building of the roads, the controlling of all this stuff, like ultimately all of that, like we can influence, we can the bog turtles can be, I keep saying bog turtles because the bog turtles are really in trouble, right? But like we can lead to habitat loss and the destruction of animal communities and the disruption of all that sort of thing, right? But like ultimately, we as people in the landscape think we can control it,
Mm.
right? We think we can divert the water. We
Mhm.
think we can build the road and put the fence and that'll keep the deer out. We look at the weather to see like when the weather is going to do the weather, right? But like ultimately, that is outside of our control,
Mhm.
right? Like we are just another animal in that ecosystem. It's like we are constantly reminded of that, right? Like when we build in a floodplain and it floods, when it snows and we can't leave the house because it's snow, right? Like when the raccoons keep getting in your garbage can, when like the carpenter bees keep coming back, when like the ants keep coming, right? When that particular cliff face keeps falling
Right.
down, right? Or the sinkhole opens up, right? Like it's ultimately out of our control, right? And
Right.
like for like us as these like Anthropocene animals that think
Mhm.
we're in control, like that is
Mhm.
a problem, right? So it's like that kind of circles around, I think, a lot of what we're talking about in a way.
We think we're in control until we're outdone by some ants.
Exactly.
No, I have an ant problem. No, the ants have a human problem. That's
Yeah,
the big
exactly.
problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so time for our Lorax moment, which I was thinking about this like all morning.
Were you?
Yes, because I was thinking about the meme. Let's talk about the cute little dudes that we are responsible for. I'm sorry, little guys. So some of the biggest ones that stand out to me, because I think they're kind of more recognizable to a lot of people in the area, the bog turtle,
Bog turtle.
the blue spotted salamander with his little grippy toes, and I'm not going to pronounce this properly, but a particular kind of bat.
Northern Myotis.
Thank you.
And
Thank
which I
you,
don't know if
person.
I'm saying that right.
I don't know. I was gonna say person who put this exhibit together. How do you say it? So how are we impacting these species in terms of like habitat loss or food or living space or pollution, maybe, for example?
I mean, it's kind of all of the above, right? And I think in many ways it is, again, not a ecologist or, you know, studier of animals, though I, enjoy animals, right?
Mhm.
But like the answer to what you're saying is like all of the things you said, right? Like habitat loss, habitat destruction, pollution, light, and like us having light all the time to do various things, right? So it's like all of these things are factors and are factors in different ways, right? Like, bog turtles and salamanders are aquatic or semi-aquatic and are very influenced by the water quality, whatever that could be, right? So it's like a shift in the water quality is a shift in the animals that cause that, right? Bats having places to roost, like I think it's roost when they're in like a place, right?
Yeah.
Which that can be by anything like, the building of new things to putting, I just always think about the when like the wind turbines, right? Which great because they're generating electricity in a way that is more environmentally friendly. But there's something I remember hearing, which I'm pretty sure about this, right? That it's like the spinning of them can be, like as bats are migrating, the spinning of the turbines can be bad for the bats. But there's like something that like at certain times of the year, you can slow that down and help the bats. But like if people do that, right? So it's like these animals kind of in our midst are very much impacted by what it is we're doing, right? In a variety of ways, right? So it's like and it's like one of my like Warehouse Valley, I wish I did. Because we do talk about these animals in there. Like I do wish I kind of highlighted it a little bit more, like looking back at it, right? Because I kind of did it purposely, like here they are, and you're seeing these, and there is that giant wall of boxes, right? Like I wanted it to be like kind of a confrontational moment in a way. Yeah, so it's like everything we do is impacting them, right? So it's like you want fireflies in the summer because you enjoy seeing them, right? But you're like
spraying your lawn.
You're spraying your lawn. Don't spray your lawn.
Do not spray your lawn. No,
it's not worth it. You are like light pollution. You are like, so it's like all these various factors about the modern world we enjoy impacts these things, right? So it's like, yeah, it is. We are in part of that ecosystem, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of, we have talked about habitat loss on land. But I know a big thing that you were talking about, if not necessarily today, but in like other conversations, that the Lehigh River is one of the most endangered in the country.
Yes.
What does that mean for a river to be endangered?
It means that it is the possibility of the collapse of the river as an ecosystem, and also kind of the collapse of the river as like in a way like a functional river, right? So it's like the pollution and all is impacting the animals that are either in, around, or near the river, that use the river, right, for a variety of reasons. And then it is the building and encroachment on the river and kind of all these things that like alter the course of the river, that change how people can interact with the river, or the river interacts with the environment, right? So it's like ultimately like that doesn't mean the river is going to like dry up and be gone, right? Though that can happen. It is this the quality of that water ecosystem is depleting in serious measurable ways. And it just like out of, a large amount of rivers and what you would imagine to be more metropolitan and or more polluted areas, the Lehigh River is very high. Though then again, like water quality in the valley, air quality in the valley, very bad, right? So, yeah, so I think it is this like, I brought that up because it's like, oh, here is something that, the valley is literally formed by this river, right? And that is in danger. And what does that mean, right? Like, what does that mean for the river, but kind of what does it mean for like identity? I think there's something to be said about like in long history, we are like humans, you build towns along rivers, right? Normally.
Yeah, this area was settled because of the
because
rivers.
of the rivers, the
Right.
forks of the Delaware, right?
Right.
But it's like we have this kind of long relationship with water, like deep, ancient, long history with waterways for food, for water itself, for transportation, right? And it's like, what does that mean when our relationship with that changes from its historical norm, right? And it becomes like a thing that just exists and then is endangered and like people don't talk about that. So I think that's kind of I think it's an important question to ask and maybe an important thing to just kind of say out loud, right? Because it's like then the question of like, what can you as an individual person do? The answer is not much, right? But there are things you can enact to happen, I think. But yeah, so I think mean, like, out of the things, I found that kind of the most distressing of this, like, ecosystem loss. Because you think, like, well, I think this is like going back to that thing I said about how all of this, like, we try to control the land, we try to control the environment ultimately will control us, right? But it's like, if you have this kind of habitat loss of a river, then that's the other part of it, right? That it's like, while we're not in control of that, we can influence that, right? So it's like that the river is endangered is in part because of us, right? Which can be said of a large amount of things, right? The polar bears. But yeah, so I think that's that other necessary part of that coin, I think.
Yeah. And we've mentioned this before in one of our previous installments, that the introduction to Warehouse Valley that we did, was that January? That vaguely rings a bell. Sorry, I don't know what time means. But we have a take action card that is available to visitors up in the exhibit. And we talked about it more in depth before, but for the folks that are new here and the folks that will maybe see this one on YouTube and before they see the other one, what are some of the ways that we can enact change or even just be more informed? Like, what's a good place to start if you understandably hear all of this information and are blown away by it and think, I have to do something, but I don't know what?
Right. So I think for historian Tim, right? Like curator Tim, the things I think about as I was making Warehouse Valley, and now that I'm like, we're like in the point where we're starting to talk about like putting Warehouse Valley to bed. So if you haven't seen Warehouse Valley, it is up through like midsummer, right?
Okay.
Like definitely through the end of June into the beginning of July. But the thing that was really important to me there was like, this has to be, we have this kind of local, very hot debate re warehouses, right? We see that kind of happening kind of over and over and over again in towns and municipalities throughout the valley and in connecting regions, right? What I think is very important is a contextualization of that debate, right? Which I think is what Warehouse Valley does, right? But like, what the call to action about it is, it's like, if this is something you are, if you're upset by this, or if you do, like, the call to action is kind of either way, right? Because I think it's like, we live in an ecosystem in which warehousing and development exists. That's the way, that's our world, right? So it kind of just is not good or bad, it just is, right? But like, I think what the call to action is, and what I know the call to action is that you can have a feeling about this, right? Like, this can make you feel a way, but if the way you feel is anger or excitement or that something needs to happen, the answer is not to then just like go on Facebook and, like, type like, I am mad about the way things are being developed, right? Like, or like, we need more of this, right? Like, the answer and like what the get involved thing is, it's involvement, right? It is like so much of the world we interact with, things that are built, things that impact us on a daily basis, right? Like, how you get from one place to another, what is built where, what communities are shaped. That happens at a very local governmental level, right?
Ding, ding, ding.
That happens at off-year elections, right? Like, we are in a off-presidential and mid.
Like,
yeah, I think there's
weeks?
a primary in 2 weeks, right? In Pennsylvania anyway. But like, it is this idea that people get super jazzed to be politically involved, the midterm election and presidential election years, but then pay very little attention to local government, right? Very little attention to their local zoning board, their local school board, any of that, right? But it's like, so like, if you have a feeling about the way your community is, or the way you want your community to be,
Mhm.
The way to do that is to somehow be involved at a local level,
Mhm.
right? Because like ultimately that's what impacts it. It's going to meetings, it's running for office, it is
Mhm.
petitioning, it is
Mhm.
doing that work. And in places where we've seen, like not to bring up in places where we have seen community shifting of developmental plans,
Mhm.
right? Or community involvement in the creation and making those plans better
Mhm.
is when the community gets involved,
Mhm.
right? So it's like ultimately that like it's a call for civic action, right? And I think like historically, like we're deep in like thinking about this is the thing there'll be a time we're talking to talk about the 18th century, I think, because we're kind of deep in it, right?
Yeah.
But like we see people historically getting very involved in local government, right?
Mhm.
And that's kind of part of the democratic process, right? So it's
Right,
like,
yeah.
I think that for us in that getting involved, it is trying to take like what could be anger, right? And channeling it, or could be a response, right? And channeling that into an action, right? And ultimately that action is involvement, right? And awareness of your local thing. Because it's not necessarily, and it's like the intention, my like intention as a historian and a curator isn't like, on one side or the other of it, right? But
Right.
rather like to be in the know and to be aware and to be involved, right? Because it's like ultimately like we all enjoy living in the modern world,
Yeah.
right? We enjoy the trappings of modernity we have, and
Right.
there is something to be said about how easy it is to get things online sometimes, right? And kind of the ease of that, right? But like that's makes certainly buying dog food much easier for those of us that do that. But like, with that comes a give and take, right? With that comes a environmental and ecological relationship, right? So I think I hate the word mindfulness, but it's like, I think like what I'm talking about ultimately is mindfulness.
No, I think in this context, it's very
Yeah, I think it's being
appropriate.
mindful. Because it's like, if we want these modern things, you need warehouses. If you want people to live in your community, you need developments.
Yeah.
If you want people to have jobs, you need places for them to work. If you want people to go to work, you need roads for them to drive, right? These aren't new problems. These are problems we've long had, right? But it's like, that can all happen, but perhaps mindfully.
Right.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from anyone before we start to wrap things up? We clocked in at under an hour today.
We did. This is rare for us.
This is, and we went on like 4 tangents.
We should
Did not
acknowledge it.
plan to talk about like half of this.
Yeah, we should acknowledge that and be proud of ourselves.
Slow progress is still progress.
Indeed.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks again to everyone for tuning in to our conversation today. As a reminder, we are held on the last Wednesday of every month at noon, and you do not need to register. So feel free to send out a Zoom link to anybody that you know that would like to tune in. For our YouTube viewers, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That still feels really fun to say. You can also support our work by visiting sigelmuseum.org/support. There are many ways that you can help us fulfill our mission, such as donating or sponsoring an artifact or sponsoring a program.
Perhaps this one.
Perhaps this one. And you can become a member at multiple levels, which gets you free admission to pretty much every program, the museum 24/7, free research in our library.
Definitely gets you free admission to this program.
Yeah, but hey now.
But no, it's a great program, gives you a lot and also helps us too.
Yes, it really does. Like I can't stress enough how much even one new membership supports us.
Absolutely.
So thank you again to everyone. We will see you next month, which will be Wednesday, May 28th at noon. And we're doing a pretty hefty one next month. It's gonna be, not to get into the weeds before we even get into the weeds, but it will be on the Nuremberg reports in our collection.
Yes.
Bet you didn't know we had that, because I sure didn't
Yep.
before I started working here, so.
Much talk of Nuremberg next time.
Yeah, you get to see me try to pronounce German. I apologize in advance. So my plan is usually I try to have these up on YouTube within 2 weeks or so. So we'll let everybody know. I'll post on our Facebook and our Instagram, and we will see you next month. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.